So I think I slightly changed it. We have trauma, healing, and the false self. So I'm gonna walk through this, and please feel free, Veronica, if people are bringing stuff up in the chat, can you please alert me to questions that may come up? Um, but where I want to start today, oh, there we go, is I actually want to start with the scripture reading. This is from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 7, verses 31 through 35. When he returned to the region of Tyre and went along the way of Sidon towards the Sea of Galilee, in the region of uh, Decapolis, they brought to him a deaf man who had an impediment in his speech, and they begged him to lay his hand on him. He took him aside in a private, away from the crowd, and put his fingers into his ears, and he spat and touched his tongue. Then looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, Ephphatha, that is, be open. And immediately his ears were open, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. I've always been fascinated with many of the healing narratives and stories that we get in the Gospels, but I've always been drawn to this one because I remember as a kid, I always thought this was so messy and disgusting that Jesus would be putting his fingers in people's ears and spitting in people's mouths, and intimacy of touch and getting into it. And I want that to kind of be the foundation, is that in a way, I think healing happens when there is like it's this messiness that there like and direct encounter. It is not something that we can intellectualize and see from a distance or observe and hope that we can shift, but it actually draws us into this messiness and into a relationship. There is this interaction that is going on. And it's something that I profoundly believe for transformative healing is this movement of getting into the messiness and understanding like and understanding it with our whole being of what's going on. So the first thing there is, I think there's this, what does it mean to be healed? One of the questions I think Jesus has asked people is, what do you want? And it's like, what do you want to be healed, or what are you asking for? And as as a practice therapist now of 10 years, I find it so interesting when that first session when I'm like, what are you here for? Like, what's going on? And the whole range of, I just want to be happy, or I just want this to go away. And what I've noticed is a lot of people, when they've been experiencing trauma or suffering or pain, however they are doing that, is sometimes it's hard to like put words to what is it that you're truly looking for. Because typically, what I've noticed is typically once I get into it with people, what they say they were coming in for and what they're really looking for 3 months later is vastly different. And some of that is I love this quote by Soren Kierkegaard. He's a Danish philosopher who is the father of existential philosophy. And I think this sums up so many of our lives, which is people settle for a level of despair that they can tolerate and call it happiness. And I believe that this is the exact opposite thing that the Lord wants from us. The Lord wants to free us, to bring us into relationship and into the fullness of life. And part of what I see, especially for when I work with people in psychotherapy, but something that we can also look for in our own life is to really be like, I don't want I don't want to tolerate my discomfort. I really want to be set free, which may cost us. And a lot of that is first reflecting on like, what are our expectations? Like when we say we want to be healed, is it that we just want pain to go away, or we just want a quick process? Or we want control over the healing process. I'm thinking right now, my sister went through a pretty nasty divorce, and I had her permission to talk about her. And one of the things that I noticed as she was going through it is she just wanted it to end as quickly as possible. Like she just needed to get away from her now ex-husband, and like like bending over backwards to whatever wishes he wanted. She just needed it to end, but that caused her pain later on. And I think it's important to slow down and really understand, what am I, when I say I want healing, what are my expectations around it? What am I looking for? And then most importantly, have I identified what needs to be healed? Um, I have a Jesuit spiritual director, and the Jesuits, if you read their spirituality, one of their most important aspects of it is the examination of conscience at the end of the day. And from a spiritual perspective, that's so important. But I would also argue from a psychological perspective, this idea of reflecting on yourself, and for the examination conscious sometimes can be like where I failed, but also examining, like, do I truly see myself the way I like, do I clearly see myself? And do I understand where I actually need healing? And that's a really important distinction, because a lot of times I think people think they know where they need healing, but in reality, where the Lord is calling them is into another space that sometimes we're not aware of. And this is why I think, whether it's through a good prayer life or spiritual direction, therapy, an honest and good friend who can help reveal these things to us, where it's like, where do we need healing? Because it's not us in our own arrogance who decides it. I think it's one of those things that we have to allow the Holy Spirit to come in and reveal, or other people who God puts into our life to help reveal what needs to be healed, because we do not heal in isolation. Um, so I'm going to pause there and see if anything's come up in the chat, Veronica, or if anyone has any comments or anything right at this moment.
Nothing in the chat, but if anyone wants to jump in, feel free to. I might just make a comment. I really like what you're saying, and something that really stands out is how our desires, I know in my experience, my desires became so enmeshed with the narcissistic people in my life that I totally lost my identity. And I didn't even know what it is that I wanted or who I am. And I
Yes.
feel like we're going to get into that a little bit. And that kind of leads into not knowing what to ask for from the Lord sometimes in prayer. We don't even know
Yes.
what we need to be healed from. It's just all a big mess.
It,
And not even having the awareness to be able to ask.
yeah. And I think
Mm-hmm.
being able also to be okay in that space of, I don't know what I need, and being honest about it. I have worked with people where it took us 4 months. Because I think whether it's a narcissistic relationship and the pain and trauma that can come from that, or uh, other sources of trauma, one of the comments that I've just it's become so familiar in the beginning stages of this process, is I will ask a question, maybe reflecting on their own identity or what they're wanting, and they will say, I don't know, I don't know, I don't know. And a lot of times that comes with shame. It's almost like I should know and I can't answer this and I must be messing up. And I want to challenge that and be like, no, it's okay to say you don't know, because that's exactly where you're at and it's exactly where you need to be.
But I guess I just wanted to comment that I think for me, healing is part of it is forgiveness, which I've been able to do, and I feel like that actually was incredibly healing for me. And that happened. I went to the Eucharist Congress in July, and that happened. But the other part of it is just making sure that I'm handling triggers and putting boundaries in place so that the effects of the abuse and the narcissistic people in my life, my mom's a narcissist as well, that I'm not taking things out on my kids. They're not the ones paying the price for what was done to me. And I think it's still a constant battle. I dealt with somebody today at work who's very narcissistic, and it can be very triggering at times. And I just want to make sure that I don't hurt my kids because somebody hurt me.
Yes, beautifully said. I love how you brought up forgiveness. There's so much good research out there about the power of forgiveness. Like there could be a whole other talk just on that topic alone. How important it is. not to like to authentically forgive, and to make sure that it is a movement of your own soul and not out of pressure or things like that. But I'm so glad you brought that up. And then, um, yes, all like boundaries and all of that are so important to this healing process, because I think to want to heal, it's the recognition that we have to put up boundaries so that so that the healing process has the space and also the protection, especially from the toxic or sources of suffering that could try and come back in. All right. Any more comments here before I move to the next slide?
Yeah, I can go real quick. Jameson, I heard you say, actually, Veronica was teasing me this past week because I kept saying, I don't know. Um, and like that's something I found like after like just being in like coming out of like a narcissistic relationship or coming out of just being in a narcissistic toxic environment to where like I actually don't know. Like there's parts of yourself that you know about, like you kind of hold on to, but then there's so many things with like your desires and like your thoughts. Like for me, I was dealing with so many like insane, like just like erratic thoughts that would just go from nowhere, and it would cause me like a lot of like distress and anxiety, and I'd provoke a lot of like emotions. But like you talk, I guess kind of getting into it, like your desires and like your thoughts and like kind of getting back in tune with yourself, and like you talk about your identity you get from God, and like I guess reforming like your identity with that to where you actually know those desires. I guess I don't know if that makes sense or not, but I
Yeah.
found for that in my life, I was like, dude, I don't
Mhm.
know. I don't even know what I want anymore because my desires and my
Yes.
thoughts are just all over the place.
And that's the direction that we're going, is because I think when we are starting to reconnect with ourselves, especially when we've been told, don't do that, don't go there, don't trust it, or it's been taken over by another person and all of our attention and emotion and will is being directed in another way, it's really uncomfortable. It's really scary. I think that's the hard part about this, is that like even though we want it to feel good, it's actually really scary at times to be like, can I trust this? Like, and I'm also being overwhelmed, and everything else is still circling around. So I think it's like this is when I teach, I often talk about this is the time that we need to help ground people. They're not ready to come to these great revolution or revelations or things like that. It's like we have to like allow that voice, that I don't know voice, to become more stable, and so that they can reconnect, and then that part of the person will start to learn language again. They'll start to be able to describe, they'll start to be able to feel and experience life differently, but it takes time. So we're going to go more into this, and hopefully there's some concepts and themes that are going to be helpful in organizing that. So I brought this up if you were at the previous talk that I gave back in October. I'm very much fascinated because if we look at it, it's only been in the last 150 years that we really have developed the field of psychology, which is about the study of the psyche, the human mind. Um, and we know that the word psyche is actually the Greek word where we get the word soul from. And if you read a lot of the New Testament manuscripts in their original, like sometimes the word psyche comes up. So what we know is that right away, I'm going to go to this quote by Victor White. He's a Dominican priest. There is indeed common ground between them, the psyche and the soul, whether it is approachable from the theologic or psychological standpoint. And I want to bring this up is I there's such a connection here that, and I often I see it in secular psychology where they will cast out the spirit and the soul and think theology is ridiculous. But I will also say I've seen it the other way, where I've seen people spiritualize the psyche and they don't want to acknowledge the psychological science. And one this is maybe it's not my I'm still I if you're asking me for a clear definition, I could never do it, but one of the ways that I've come to really understand this is that the soul is the essence of who you are, well the psyche is the mental manifestation of that essence. So what I think is really important about that is we all think. We have thoughts that come in, we have intrusive thoughts, thoughts that come from nowhere. We're like, what are we doing? And this is what I would say, it's the mental manifestation. It's the way we understand ourselves, the world, our relationships. And why I think there's a danger in moving to one direction over the other is, I've worked with people who have been told to pray the depression away. And well, like that doesn't work. It definitely helps to pray and to bring our spirituality into it, but we also have a science of recognizing how the human mind works, how we can get caught in mental traps that are not helpful for us, and then also how it can be a barrier that I've worked with people where they're like, I know that I'm a beloved child of God, but I can never get my head wrapped around that. It's like mentally something is always getting in the way of embracing that part of their identity. So I bring this up because I think to do the depth of healing is to recognize that the soul and the psyche are so interconnected and needs to be addressed. When I do therapy, I am no priest, I am no spiritual master or even a spiritual director, but I always want to leave space for my client to bring in their faith, their understand what's going on in their prayer life, and that the Holy Spirit always has room in our process. But I also know that my role is to really work with the psychological aspect of an individual. So I just have that there to kind of set a framework of as we move into this next segment. Come on.
Just want to say I love that definition, the soul and the psyche. I haven't heard that before, so that's helpful.
There we go. All right. Yeah, where is it? Victor White actually, he is if you enjoy reading very heady books, it's called The Soul and the Psyche, and he is a Dominican priest who also became a Jungian analyst and like was involved in teaching Jungian analysts. So like he very much had his feet in both worlds and was very into writing about it. So I can share that if anyone is ever interested. So in the end, we all go through life wounded. It is a part of our human condition that this is C.S. Lewis's whole book, The Problem of Pain. Original sin came into the world, and we have our wound, and we go through life wounded. Some of it is unintentional. Some of it is we experience intentional woundedness, whether it's from a parent or from someone who we thought loved us or what that could be. And the reality is that, and this is a line that I got from the John Paul II Healing Institute so this is their line. So I'm going to give them the credit. It's what is not transformed is transferred. And I actually think this shows that there is really a moral responsibility to be like, I need to confront my woundedness, because if I don't, it will get passed on to the relationships around me, if I have children, whatever that could be. And I think what I like about this calling is I think the Lord wants to meet us here. It's not this calling where we go into this abyss and we're alone, but rather it is a grace-filled movement of the Lord calling us in, just as the Lord's heart was pierced, allowing ourselves to look at our own pierced wounds and allowing them to be transformed. So going to Ian's point about like, I don't know. Sometimes the first step in our woundedness is starting to define am I able to clearly speak about my trauma, my experience, narcissism that has occurred around me. And this can actually be really anxiety provoking, because when people start talking about this, they'll one say, I'm rambling. Or two, they will be like, I must not be making sense. And what I hear in that is, you've never been given the opportunity to allow yourself to define and have someone listen. because before it's always been shut down. Before you've never been given the space to do that. So the first step here with our woundedness is define it. Define the trauma, define that experience so that you become confident in it. Just like we become confident in the death and resurrection of Christ, it is clearly articulated in a way. There has to be our own confidence in, I can tell my story. And when I tell it or when I define it, I don't feel, maybe I am not rambling, or I know what I'm about. And I start to have control over the story instead of the story having control over me. Because Henry Nouwen, if you have not discovered him, I think he's wonderful. He's also, I think he was a French priest who got really involved in the l'Arc community, which is like a community that individuals with severe developmental delays who would need like care, like you can volunteer and be a part of this, and it's a wonderful, wonderful worldwide community. And he's written a lot of books, and one of them is called The Wounded Healer. And this is the tagline from the book, which is, it is in our woundedness that we can become a source of life for others. And this is the spiritual reality, I think, reveals the psychological reality, is that when we allow our wounds to be healed, they actually become a source of life. And we grow bigger than them. They don't have the damaging effect that we so often experience, that we start to be able to pour out love onto others through these wounds. And that is why the risen Lord, the wounds of crucifixion are not healed. The wounds are gaping and open. And I think as we think about the psychological healing, it's the same thing will be there. It's not about having this closure and everything's going to feel better, but it's rather going to be this transformation. Or as I like to tell my students, we're going to have a change in relationship to our trauma or to our experience, that we have grown bigger than it, and we're going to be able to thrive and give back in ways that we actually at one point thought would be impossible. Any thoughts here? Questions or stories?
That's really good. We were just at the Healing the Whole Person retreat actually in Denver, and I feel like you've summarized the gist of it in this one slide you said. So yeah, thank you for the points.
Yeah, I will just to give a plug. So the JP2 Healing Institute, they're based out of Tallahassee, Florida. They really do a wonderful job. Dr. Bob Schutz, the founder of it, he is very solid. And I've been to a retreat myself. So if that is something that you run across and you have the time and energy and resources and all of that, it is a good experience, and they do a good job. It's been a couple of years. I don't know if they've changed their how it's structured, but my experience was good with it. So I just wanted to say that's a great Catholic resource there. Other thoughts or things before I move on? All right. So this is where hopefully we're going to spend a lot of our time. The false self. So these weird looking masks are actually relics from ancient Greece, and they're personas. So in the theaters of ancient Greece, the actors would wear these masks and they would play out a role. And to a certain degree, we all actually play out a role. Like right now, you could argue I'm wearing a mask as Jameson Natwick, therapist, like who I am as a father when my 6-year-old and my newborn are around. I'm a very different person. So to a certain degree, we kind of have different masks we wear, which is normal. But what's really dangerous is when these masks take over and they become our identity, because in the end, it's a mask. It's not who we are. It's not who God created us to be. So I'm going to start by speaking this from a psychological perspective, and then we can bring the spiritual aspects into this. So Winnicott is a British psychoanalyst brilliant. And he was the one that came up psychologically with this concept of the false self. He says the false self is set up to protect the true self, to respond to the challenges in the environment. The false self essentially takes up the role of social compliance. So, at a very young age, for all of us, we start to be born into a world where we understand we are an individual, but we are social creatures and we are part of family systems and larger communities. And we start to learn what helps us fit in, what helps us get along, what helps us feel safe. And the reality is it's been well documented at an early age and often throughout our life, we often choose attachment over authenticity. And what that means is we will often choose, well, I want to be in good relationship with my mom. So even though I feel like I really like, here's a superficial example. I want to be in relationship with my mom and she loves piano. So I'm just going to deal with it and play piano because it makes me feel connected to my mom. When in reality, I really wanted to play soccer and I wish I would have invested there. So that's a very superficial example. But we can see how this happens over and over and over again, where we are afraid to show our true self and we allow this false self to take over to protect us because we want to fit in to our family systems, to our relationships, and not to have conflict and problems. Because I think there's a fear that if the true self comes out and is rejected, it is the ultimate wound. It is the ultimate, if I show you who I am and you reject it, it will be a pain to such a great magnitude that I will not be able to endure it. So I will create a false self to protect, and I will then lean into it. Henry Nouwen builds on this in a spiritual way and really starts talking about how the false self is one that it's in our own pride. It's like, well, this is who I want to be. I'm going to create something better than God's creation because God really messed up because I don't like who I am. So I'm going to try and have this false self up here that I'm always trying to live up to. And we feel the pain then because we can never live up to it. So we can see and over again, this false self is this lie that gets in the way and we cling to it. As my spiritual director would say, the false self is the last to die. Because what is really dangerous about it is sometimes we've fallen in love with it. We've fallen in love with aspects of it. So I'm going to pause there. I kind of dropped a lot, and I really would like to see if there's comments or questions, or maybe ways that I was confusing.
I'm just reflecting on this, and from my own journey, it's like what you said, the death of the false self is really that turning point from a spiritual lens where you really begin to like conform your heart to Christ and really lower your pride, at least in my experience. And I'm just thinking of narcissists and how they just can't get rid of that false self. Like they have so much pride. They're so stuck in this false lens and view of themselves, and they project that. But yeah, that death to self, that death of the ego, the death of the false self can be very scary and very psychologically alarming because you don't really know what's on the next step.
Yes,
Or around that corner.
especially when the false self is protective. So I'm gonna here's when there are a lot of times when I'm working with an individual and it becomes clear that this intervention would be helpful is there was someone's childhood, let's say, where there's this part of them that protected them. It was like relationships are dangerous, so I'm going to behave in this certain way. And it's not true to who they were. And there comes a point in therapy at times where we will I call it like we role play literally, where we invite that 8-year-old self of that client to come into the room. And I have my client say goodbye to their 8-year-old self. Like, thank you. Like, you helped me. I could not have survived everything I went through, but I am now at a place that I need to say goodbye to you. And and it's always emotional. It is like they're losing about, even though they hate it because it's started to be a barrier or it's caused other problems in their life. When the time comes to say goodbye to it, it's so emotional because it's like this part of me that has protected me, even though it wasn't good or what God has wanted, it still was helpful. And I have to let go of it. And then, as Veronica pointed out, it is scary because it's like, what's replacing it? What is coming? And then, I mean, this is faith. And then we truly have our encounter. Do we trust in the goodness of God? It is in that moment that you will find out where your faith is at, because it's like, do I trust? Can I let this go and go into this next space blindly and be like, the Lord has me in this moment? So I'm just
And
yes.
how do you know, Jameson, if you've gotten rid of the false self? Like, is it always going to be there to some degree, or can you fully heal from it?
So what I love Carl Jung. I think I have my critiques of him, but I also think he touched on things that are really important. And one of his concepts that I love is this idea of circumambulating. So that is this really fancy word for the idea of walking around something. So in some religions or other traditions, you will see this pattern of people walking around. And psychologically, what I have seen over and over again is you will see that this false self, like a person will deal with it and then it seems to disappear. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, it's coming back again, but it's different. And I think it's this ever processing, like, okay, it's something that we'll probably always wrestle with.
Maybe
The
almost like a
idea,
spiral, like we're almost
yes,
elevating.
if
Yeah.
it is a spiral that it changes all the time, but its flavor's still there. It's not what it once was when you first encountered it, but it's still there and you've understood it in a new way. And at first, when we first start the healing journey, we don't want that. We want someone to tell us you're going to do A, B, and C, you're going to be healed and never deal with it again, and wonderful, this is your life, and then you can move forward. That's not the way. The way really is this, it's a journey. And sometimes it's an annoying companion that decides to hang out with us way too long, but we have to welcome it. It's like, the Lord brought this in, so I will encounter it. And over time, it really does become transformed and it becomes very different from where you started out on this journey. I'm just checking okay. I'm just making sure there's no questions coming up in the chat.
None that I see, but yeah. Just for the comment about the spiral, I was thinking like a spiral, like almost going upwards, like we're getting closer and closer and elevating more and more to Christ as we're feeling, and like new versions are being revealed, but we're constantly kind of evolving.
I love that, and I also think so when we going back to definitions. Definitions aren't just like, oh, I can use words to define. I also think definitions are images. Like, that's a beautiful image that for Veronica works. This idea of it's a spiral, always ascending, always getting higher and higher towards Christ. And that is a really beautiful image because it's one like you've got from yourself and it's not manufactured by me. It's not me trying to tell you this is how it will be. You've taken it and made it your own. So I'm glad the spiral image has taken hold in its own unique way.
But Jameson, we want the answers because we don't know. I'm kidding. Tell us.
I think
no.
Well, and I think, this is the lie of, I think, so much of modern science is the idea that we can master the world and come up with perfect answers. And if you talk to anyone, whether it's in the medical field, my field, heck, my wife's an aerospace engineer, and as much as we can fly planes around the world, and send rockets into space, there's so much about the physical world that we still don't understand. There's so much about the human body we don't understand. I think it's really that calling of, okay, we need to put aside the childish things where there won't be absolutes, and I need to mature and be like, this is a process. I need to lean in and be taught by the Lord's creation. Like be like the Lord made the human mind. Who are we to try and come up with an answer when it's more of like, all right, as I heal, as I explore who I am, I'm also going to trust that you're in this process. So let's moving on to the next slide. There we go. Becoming who we're created to be. So this image here is from the book of Genesis. It's when Jacob wrestles with the angel, and they wrestle through the night, and then the angel wounds the hip of Jacob, and Jacob asks for the angel's blessing, and he is renamed Israel. So I have that here because I think when we are becoming who we're created to be, when understanding who God called us to be by name, that I really do think it's like a wrestling match sometimes with God. That it's not this like beautiful path. Like sometimes it could be like, I don't understand why you brought me here. And we know this is a reality because if you read the prophets, the Psalms, you just hear this agony of like, where are you, God? Like, what am I like? Why am I wrestling with all of this stuff? And I feel abandoned by you, but I still trust in you. And that is, I think, part of this process. It is the saying yes to, I am willing to do this work now and understand who you have created me to be. And that as much as I want to say I know who I am, I know nothing. So James Hollis is another American psychologist, and I love this quote of his. We each have an appointment with ourselves, though most of us never show up for it. I think there is this calling where we do have to confront ourselves. Like we have to like one of the I've been asked what's the difference between like spiritual direction and like psychotherapy. And what I've talked to my spiritual director about is spiritual direction is really about one's relationship with God and the Holy Spirit and the movements. Where is God calling you? My belief is that good psychotherapy should have you have to confront yourself. Like I tell my students all the time, like, don't be a validation therapist. If all you do is tell people like, oh my goodness, that must be so difficult for you, like that's not good therapy. It feels really good, but that there's no transformation and you are placating people and probably causing harm. Like as I talked about last time, if I was a couples therapist working with a narcissistic couple and I just validated everything, I am wounding the person who is in that relationship. Like, because good therapy should have you confront yourself, make you look at things where you're like, I've never known that about myself, or why do I do the things that I do? And really look at it, because to me, therapy is not this, I don't want it to be navel gazing, as St. Augustine talks about curling in on oneself. I often like to think of it as like there should be this rebound effect. As you go into yourself and understand yourself, it allows you actually to move further out into the world and connect with other people in new ways. So there's kind of this polarizing tension as you go deeper to understand yourself. You also are able to reach out and connect with people in new ways. So we look at the authentic self, and this is the work that I think we all long for. I would say this is the desire of the human soul, is to be able to be free, because that is what Saint Irenaeus says, is the glory of God is man fully alive. And this is going to speak on what Ian brought up, is this is the work of reconnecting or rediscovering the lost parts of ourself. Through trauma, This is my fundamental belief. When we have encountered pain, suffering, trauma, however you would want to define it, the false self takes over and it completely disconnects you from parts of yourself that are beautiful and wonderful. And I'll use myself as an example. I did not grow up with narcissistic parents or a family member, but I did have a mother who was very emotionally volatile. So her moods were all over the place. And I learned very on that it would be best for me to just be the peacemaker, the mediator, help everyone get through the calm. And now we all wonder how I got into this profession. It was like I was training for it since I was 6 years old. What I was disconnected from is I forgot how to stand up for myself, how to stand up for my values and my principles and my beliefs, because I spent so much of my identity was taking care of other people's emotions and making peace, that I have had to do so much work to be like, what is it like for me to be angry? Is that okay? For a long time, it felt sinful. How dare I have these thoughts? Like, and it's like, no, it's okay to be angry. Christ was angry. Like, he flipped tables in the temple. Like, it's a natural emotion of the human experience. So, whether I'm working with people or all of that is I think this work can be done outside of therapy. It can be happen in wonderful relationships in our prayer life. It's the really allowing this space for us to encounter things that often will feel forbidden, dangerous, or uncomfortable. Because I think that's when we've lost or we don't know how to connect to it, it's uncomfortable to reconnect to it. And unfortunately, we live in a society that is so based on being comfortable. Like, if you're not doing something that's pleasurable, then that, like, you shouldn't do it. So this is the painful work. It's like I am going to choose to start reconnecting and rediscovering these parts of myself and befriending them. Recognizing, like, wow, like, even though I learned that anger was bad, I'm now realizing that it actually is like a holy anger is a beautiful thing to have in one's life and is necessary. So are there any questions or comments here? Stories?
I have a question, Jameson.
Yeah, Catherine.
Yeah, so what would you suggest to something like anger? Like, if you've grown up in an environment where it has molded you to become more of a like people pleaser, and something like getting angry can feel extremely threatening. How do you overcome that? Like, or it's just a very long process? Like, because
Yeah.
those child parts, like, even though we want to confront them, but it oftentimes, at least for me, it feels like an automatic reaction, and like it's
Yes.
so threatening to the point where it's just easier to placate, to appease, because you feel like you're very unsafe.
Yes. So the first thing you bring up is we first have to become conscious of it. Like, it's a really, like, when there are so many things, what I have observed people throughout the world or even within myself, I'm like, we go through so many unconscious actions, but when we start to recognize, whoa, like using anger, I don't like this. It feels dangerous. I get taken over by it really quickly, or there's this impulse to do, like, there's a certain behavior, like it's the trigger. The moment I think about being angry, there's this trigger that leads me over here, which is how I've always acted. The first thing psychologically, I would say any good therapist would do is we have to identify the behaviors and patterns that we're wanting to change. We need the awareness of this is what's happening. And sometimes that takes time. And some of that is first the desire to, like, want to start exploring it will start to reveal that. We start to become more conscious of it. The other thing is, I actually think that when the false self starts to get threatened, one of its greatest things is it loves to be judgmental and provide moral judgments on things. And what I mean by that is, how often, if you just think about the way maybe you behave, things that you say, the way you feel, we are so harsh and judgmental towards ourselves. Like our internal voice is so cruel to ourselves. And I always work with people to start being more neutral, because if we place a value, if we do a judgment on it, like that's bad, I shouldn't be angry, it's really hard to work with it because we've just already made this stance that anger bad. And we have to first take that step back and be like, what would it be like to go back to that childlike state of wonder and curiosity and just look at it? Like, what is it like when I get angry? What feelings come up? Um, like, what do I want to do? And we're not asking, I wouldn't ask the client to do anything with that. I would want them to start really being able to hold it differently. Does that make sense so far, Catherine?
Kind of.
Okay. Well, let me try this from another way. A lot of like, so this is where like I believe we have to acknowledge like the psyche is real, because we get caught in these patterns and they are so ingrained. And like it could just be things like, this is how I've acted always from childhood, or anytime someone raises their voice at me, the first thing I want to do is just go run away, or I shut down. Like that's just an immediate response. So to really work with that, it's one is, especially when there's trauma or like extreme suffering involved, we want to make sure that you're not being flooded too much, because if you're in a heightened state of arousal, you can't change it. Like the body is just like that defense mechanism is taking over. When someone is able to start tolerating, like, okay, like I got yelled at and I was able to take 3 deep breaths and stay there, but then I wanted to run. That would be a huge change that I would celebrate. I'd be like, you did something differently, because it's a slow process where we're integrating new ways of behaving to help them understand. When all of that is in place, then that deeper work of asking those questions of like, what is it like when you get angry? Or what would happen if you got angry as a child? Or how is anger expressed as a child? All of those are really helpful of expanding, like, how did these ways of being come to be for you? So hopefully I'm circling around something that's making sense. Or is there a follow-up question, Catherine?
Um, yeah, I'm just like, in terms of a practical application, let's say that, like, just recently I had a meeting with a coworker where, like, he did things that wasn't like it kind of hurt me. And just even like having a meeting with this person was just it was very difficult, just like the thought of the confrontation. So, in that case, like, are you suggesting we hold that discomfort, like before we talk to the person, or after, just to kind of help us through some like a meeting like that?
Great question, because some of that is, it's like I work with people where they're like, I have a meeting with a coworker, I'm already uncomfortable for it. Like I'm not looking forward to it. It's happening tomorrow. And I will do a lot of work being like, okay, let's really go through what's bringing up the discomfort, what fears are coming up. Because a lot of times when it's before, we're going to start future tripping and worried about everything that could go wrong. Whereas afterwards, it's a different way of processing. And from so I guess the first thing is, I think it would depend on like either one can be helpful. They're just helpful in different ways. One, I would be preparing someone for helping them have a different experience. And the other one, processing like, what happened? How do we make sense of that experience that you were feeling uncomfortable by? And a lot of this is like I would say, especially with narcissistic abuse, the idea of being in conflict is terrible. Because it will often lead to this like I'm going to be beaten up and not heard and not validated and not seen. So any kind of conflict is going to mirror that experience due to a trauma we've had. Now I'm rambling, so I'm going to pause and just see where you're at, Catherine, or if other people have comments or questions.
I can kind of, so I've always kind of struggled with anger just because it's always kind of been a part of my relationship with the narcissist in my life. Um, and I've definitely taken like a different approach where I've like really internalized it until it's like too much, and then it's just like an outburst. Um, I don't know how to like. I mean, I just have like a desire for like justice and like righting those wrongs that the narcissist does, but obviously like they don't understand that anything that they do is wrong. Like it's like my problem. How do you process that, I guess, a in a healthy way?
Yeah. So often, especially with anger, especially when it gets internalized, like when someone has done wrong to you, but you feel like you can't be angry towards the person because it won't be beneficial, it won't be helpful, it will cause more problems. It gets internalized, and that can be a weapon towards us. So then we're beating ourselves up, we're angry at ourselves, but then it bursts out. Um, One of the things first to recognize is, especially with anger, I think anger is the emotion of justice. Like it is, like you like, and the human soul is so aware of injustice, and we want justice. It's a very innate calling for us. Like here's a silly example. I have a 1 month old now, and a 6 year old. And my 6 year old, I asked to set the table. And she literally, not joking, was like, how come Isabel, my 1 month old, doesn't have to set the table? Like this, my 6 year old already has seen this difference of like responsibility and wants it to be equal. But when it comes to what Ian was bringing up, which is like, what do we do when we can't get justice? Or justice is not going to be obtained in the way that we want. So like I mean, Ian, one of the first things that you did there is that I think just stating that out loud, like to hear you say it out loud, I am not going to get the justice I want because of, the narcissist will never admit they're wrong. Um, and there's a lot of power in saying things out loud. I mean, the Catholic Church has known this for centuries because we have the sacrament of confession. You literally go and speak out loud your sins, and it is such an incredible experience with that. And the same thing, like in therapy, is or talking to someone, being able to be like, I'm so angry and sad that I will not get the justice I want. Because when we are able to speak it, we can then start to deal with the other emotions that are coming up. So, Ian, if I can use your story as an example, that anger is also like I would hypothesize is there's going to be sadness. Like you're not going to get that. There's a relationship that you're wanting to be healed through justice that's not going to happen. And I would want to draw out that full spectrum of the emotion because that is the fullness of what's happening in this moment, is to hold it all. Um, and then, for some people, it's really helpful for them to hear, like, there's some really good research around it. So some people want psychoed. But for me, I think I would want to hear the desire of the heart. Like, so really asking, we don't need to do it here, Ian, but I'd really want to ask, like, okay, what does justice mean to you? Why are you needing that from your father? Like, what would that mean to you? Like, really expand that so I fully understand this desire. And then that we're defining it, and then we can allow the Lord to come in and heal and provide maybe a new thing that we couldn't even imagine. Because that's what I believe God does in therapy, is new things come in that I've never ever anticipated.
Appreciate that.
I think that's a good point you brought up, Jameson, is that the primary emotion you might be feeling, there's like deeper layers to it, and it could be masking something else that we're really grieving under.
Yeah, and I think And that's the work of getting to the authentic self is, at the beginning where it's like, do we really know it needs to be healed? And I'm not trying to, like, that's not meant to be this kind of derogatory or like, oh, like you really don't know. That's not what I'm getting at. But I think like when we really do reflective work, when you really start doing it, you start to realize like how much you're realizing is coming up from this. So a lot of times it could be like, yeah, this is what I think it is. But as we feel it, explore it, understand it, new things are going to emerge and we accept them as they come. And that is, I think, one of the most brutal parts of the healing journey is realizing like things are going to emerge that I may not want to deal with. Like parts of myself that I really don't like, or parts of myself that are really insecure or hurt or wounded, whatever that could be. And this kind of what we're talking about here kind of leads me to this other Henry Nouwen quote, which is the authentic, beloved individual that God created. And the greatest enemy to the authentic self in the spiritual life is self-rejection. And I think this goes back, this is when you see people clinging to the false self, that like their authentic self who God created them to be is starting to emerge. And they're like, I don't want that. Like, take it away. I'm going to reject that because we are going back then to that false self. And it's brutal. And it's messy. And because I know in my own healing journey, there have been times things have come up and I've been like, I don't want that. And I think this is the Garden of Gethsemane in the psychological life, which is, I mean, even Christ was like, please take this cup from me. I do not want it. And I think psychologically, we're going to have that same thing. We're like, I don't want this. Don't show this to me. Don't make me have this. When I've worked with someone for a long time, I still remember working with her. And I remember there was a session where she started pleading with me. She's like, Jameson, don't make me go. Don't like I didn't even know what she was talking about. She just kept telling me, don't make me, I don't want that. I don't want there. Because I do think part of that healing is we meet parts of ourselves that are hard to hold at first, but it's necessary as we walk the way. All right. Any questions, comments?
I'll just make a comment. I think it's I've had that experience myself, right? Where it feels safer to stay in a bad situation than to go and change and you don't even know what you're going to expect. It's like that loss of control. And especially as a Christian, when we're called to a higher version of ourselves, it can be scary because it's like, well, where are you calling me towards, God? Like, I don't know if I can trust you. There's a big leap of faith with that. And it can be terrifying because we want to cling on to familiarity, even though it's bad for us or worse for us.
Veronica, what you're bringing up, if you've heard of the band Switchfoot, I can't remember which song this is, but they have a lyric that I've kind of been attached to for years. And it goes, we would rather face the pain that is all too familiar than be broken by a love we don't understand.
100%.
And that is, it's actually a very, like, I think it breaks this idealized view of what healing is. Because I think we all say we want it, but when it comes to I'm going to be broken and remade, ooh, that is hard. That is very difficult. And when I like the first session when I work with people, I'm like, this is hard, and you're not in this alone. But I want to acknowledge like this isn't just like your life will be transformed, but this is hard work that you are investing in, but it's worth it in the end. This is one of my favorite paintings because I think as we end, like we see Thomas literally having his finger into the side of Christ. And it kind of goes into what we were talking about, like to be broken, to be healed is intimate encounter with a wound, that we can't just observe it from a distance. That a lot of times that's where we start. Um, did I use my stray dog analogy last time I talked? Okay. So this is often how I view trauma work, work of suffering, work of extreme pain. And hopefully, Catherine, this helps kind of bring even more light to what I was trying to relay with you. Is a lot of times when we're ready for our healing journey, we have to look at our wound as this stray feral dog. And if you think about a stray feral dog, you're not going to run up to it and try and hug it. You'd probably be bit, or it's going to run away from you and hide. What you have to do is you slowly, maybe you start by sitting on a chair a block away, and then you're able to move to being 200 meters away, and then you're 100 meters away. And then eventually the dog is more comfortable with you that you can sit next to it. And you can now sit next to it and give it food. And then the dog will allow you to pet it. But it takes time. We just can't rush into it because it will be too intense and we won't be able to process and make sense of it. And part of that is then also, as we talked about, is letting go our protective parts. As much as we want to let them, as much as we want healing in our life, we also need to acknowledge that most likely there are parts that you're trying to say goodbye to that will break your heart. Maybe a version of yourself that you've really come to enjoy. Here's the main one that I see. Oh, perfectionists. They say they want to change, but the moment you start challenging them and having them let go of it, they can't, because their perfectionism has become such an ally to their career or how they do things that they're like, I don't want to let it go. It's good for me. And I guess I can deal with it. If this is like, I'll just deal with it. And I have people then stop therapy. Or anxiety. People eventually will be like, my anxiety protected me. And I always like it because I need it there. Like, it helps me always be vigilant. Because in the end, like, confrontation is the only way through. This is why Christ tells us to pick up our cross, because it is the confrontation. There is no other way to heal. Like, we have to confront it. And the last thing I want to say is this healing journey, I don't think is this like, okay, you're going to do it for 2 years. It's a lifelong one. I know my own wounds. Like, if the Lord graces me with a long life, I'll be 85 and I probably will still be healing from a wound in a very different way. And I think that, it's about the journey. Like, fullness resides in the journey, not in the destination. Like, as we are walking through here on earth, and it's like, okay, I'm going to walk this journey faithfully. And I'm doing it for myself, but also for those around me, children, friends, and family, but also for the Lord, because the Lord wants us to be our authentic self. That is who the Lord loves. The Lord does not love our false self or who we think we should be. The Lord wants to love our authentic self. And this is why I think this healing is so important, because then the Lord can transform it.